Tammy Wynette and George Jones, country music's most legendary couple, had lived through passion, heartbreak, and years of silence. They had been partners in love and on stage, then bitterly estranged, their lives unfolding in separate orbits. Yet in the final chapter of Tammy's life, there came a moment when all the years of distance seemed to dissolve. A few quiet words passed between them, words that would echo in George's memory for the rest of his days. He never repeated them in public, but those close to him say they carried the weight of every song they ever sang together. And when the world learned the truth, fans were in tears. Before Tammy Wynette and George Jones became the cautionary tale of country music, they were its shining crown. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, no pairing captured the heart of America quite like they did. Tammy, with her plaintive voice and the unshakable poise of a woman who had lived through hardship, was already the reigning First Lady of country music. George, with his raw, aching delivery and his knack for turning pain into poetry, was considered by many to be the greatest country singer alive. They met at a time when both were searching for something beyond the stage lights. Tammy had risen quickly to the top of the charts with songs like Stand By Your Man and Divorce, each lyric carrying a slice of her real life. George was a veteran of the Grand Ole Opry stage, his own catalog filled with songs that could bring an audience to tears. Yet behind the curtain, he was battling demons, alcohol, erratic behavior, and the pressures of fame that had already cost him one marriage. When they joined forces, the chemistry was immediate. On stage, their voices blended so naturally it felt predestined. Off stage, they became inseparable. Their marriage in 1969 was celebrated not just by fans, but by the entire country music community. The industry saw them as royalty, two artists who seemed to embody the stories they sang. But what no one realized was how much their music was both a reflection and a foreshadowing. Love songs were often followed by heartbreak ballads. Even in their happiest years, the cracks were there. George's struggles with drinking were no secret, and Tammy's own health issues were beginning to cast shadows on her demanding tour schedule. Yet, in the beginning, they fought to keep the music and the marriage in harmony. They recorded duet albums that sold in the millions. Songs like We're Gonna Hold On painted a portrait of resilience, as if singing the words could make them true. For fans, the Wynette-Jones partnership felt like living proof that love could survive anything, even the hardest roads. There was an intimacy to their performances that audiences could feel. Tammy often looked at George while singing as if no one else was in the room. George, despite his often turbulent moods, seemed to settle when she was beside him. It was the kind of connection that could not be faked. But fame has a way of magnifying every flaw. As the 70s went on, the pressures of constant touring, the public's fascination with their private life, and George's increasingly unpredictable behavior began to erode the bond. Tammy tried to shield their relationship from the tabloids, but the truth began to slip through in rumors and headlines. Still, for a time, the music held them together. Even when things were tense at home, they could step on stage, hold a microphone, and make magic happen. In those moments, it seemed as though nothing could touch them. Yet, the same songs that once bound them would later feel like bittersweet reminders, because behind the applause, the marriage was starting to crumble. And though neither could know it then, the words Tammy would one day speak to George in the final chapter of her life would hold the weight of both their glory days and their deepest regrets. By the mid-1970s, the golden sheen of the Wynette-Jones marriage had started to fade. The same chemistry that once fueled their love and music had begun to turn volatile. George's drinking, long a shadow over his personal and professional life, became harder for Tammy to manage. Missed shows, canceled appearances, and erratic behavior earned him the reputation of being unreliable, even as his talent remained undeniable. Tammy, meanwhile, was shouldering the weight of their public image. She had always been fiercely professional, determined to give her audience what they came for. But behind the smiles, she was exhausted, physically and emotionally. Touring with George often meant playing not just the role of duet partner, but caretaker. When George was sober, he could be charming, loving, and deeply attentive. When he wasn't, the strain could be unbearable. Friends and fellow musicians remember the slow unraveling. There were shouting matches backstage, long silences in the tour bus, and periods when they would retreat to separate hotel rooms after a show. Yet both understood the stakes. They were country music's most beloved couple, and their fans believed in them. Ending things wasn't just a personal decision. It would be a public heartbreak. The breaking point came in 1975. Tammy filed for divorce, citing irreconcilable differences. The announcement sent shockwaves through Nashville and beyond. Fans who had grown up on their love songs struggled to believe that the partnership was over. For Tammy, the decision was both necessary and devastating. She had invested herself fully in trying to hold things together, but the toll on her health and happiness had become too great. For George, the split marked the beginning of a long and painful reckoning. In interviews years later, he admitted that his own actions had played a large role in driving Tammy away. Still, the bond between them was not entirely severed. They shared a complicated history, one that could not be erased by legal documents. The two would occasionally cross paths at award shows, recording sessions, or special performances, and there was always a flicker of the old connection. Yet, in those years after the divorce, they rarely spoke in private. Each moved on in different ways. Tammy remarried twice, continuing to tour and record, though her health problems grew more serious over time. George fought to revive his career and eventually remarried as well, finding stability with his fourth wife, Nancy. Still, their fans never stopped hoping for a reunion, at least musically, and every so often, that hope was rewarded. In the 1980s, they recorded together again, producing songs that carried the familiar magic, but now tinged with the ache of experience. Two-Story House and Golden Ring were among their most memorable post-divorce collaborations, resonating because they sounded like lived truth. Even so, there was a distance between them that remained. The easy intimacy of their early years had been replaced by a cautious politeness. They could laugh together on stage, but when the lights went down, they returned to separate lives. And yet, the story didn't end there, because fate, in its own way, had one last encounter planned for them. An encounter that would take place not on stage or in a recording booth, but in the quiet shadow of Tammy's final days. It was then that she would speak the words George would never forget, words that, when finally revealed, would leave fans in tears. By the mid-1990s, Tammy Wynette had lived a life that few could match in triumph or tragedy. She had recorded dozens of albums, won multiple awards, and remained one of the most recognizable voices in country music. Yet her personal life was marked by relentless health struggles. Years of surgeries, chronic pain, and hospital visits had taken their toll. Still, Tammy kept performing, determined to meet her obligations and give her fans the music they loved. Privately, those close to her knew she was running on sheer willpower. Tammy rarely complained in public, but her inner circle saw how difficult even simple tasks could be in her later years. She had developed a fierce independence, the kind born from decades of navigating an industry where women often had to fight to be taken seriously. During this time, George Jones was experiencing his own renaissance. He had beaten back some of his old demons, largely thanks to the stability brought by his wife, Nancy. His career had found new footing, with younger generations of country fans discovering his music. Yet for all his success, there was a quiet understanding that certain parts of his life could never be fully resolved. Tammy chief among them. The two had not been close for years. While they occasionally shared a stage for special appearances, they no longer spent time together off stage. The bond that once defined them had been buried under years of distance and old wounds. But there remained a mutual respect, and perhaps something even deeper that neither fully acknowledged. Then, in the late 90s, an unexpected event brought them into the same room again. A televised reunion performance was being planned, one that aimed to celebrate their musical legacy. The producers believed that pairing them for even one song would be a historic moment. To everyone's surprise, both Tammy and George agreed. When they walked into rehearsal, the air was thick with nostalgia and something unspoken. They hadn't been alone together in years, yet as soon as they began to sing, the old magic flickered back. George's voice still wrapped around Tammy's like it had in the early 70s, and Tammy's eyes softened in a way that suggested she was remembering more than just the lyrics. The performance was a success, but what lingered most was what happened afterward. As the crew packed up and the lights dimmed, George lingered near the stage. Tammy, moving slowly but with her usual grace, approached him. They spoke quietly, away from cameras, just the two of them. No one could hear the words exchanged, but George later described it as a moment of peace between them. From that night on, their paths crossed more often. Not in a romantic sense, both were settled in separate lives, but in a way that suggested a silent truce had been called. They appeared together at a handful of events, posed for photographs, and even shared brief duets on special occasions. It was as if they had decided, without ever saying it aloud, that whatever time was left should not be spent in bitterness. Tammy's health, however, continued to decline. By early 1998, her condition had worsened significantly. She had endured more than 30 medical procedures over the years, and the strain was becoming impossible to hide. Yet, she still pushed herself to appear in public, still wore her signature gowns, still smiled for her fans. And then, in those final weeks, fate placed George Jones at her side one last time. Not in front of a crowd, not for a camera, just the two of them, in the stillness of a quiet Nashville room. According to those closest to the pair, Tammy's final words to George were ones of love and forgiveness, the kind that could only come from someone who had shared a lifetime of music, history, and heartache with him. They were simple, heartfelt, and lasting, and from that moment on, George carried them with him, as if they were the closing line in the song they had been writing together all their lives. For George Jones, that last conversation was more than a farewell. It was a bridge over decades of triumphs, losses, and the long stretches of silence between them. Friends noticed the change almost immediately. George, who had often spoken candidly about his mistakes, became softer when Tammy's name came up. There was no trace of old resentments, only a deep, unspoken respect for the woman who had shaped so much of his life on and off the stage. He never repeated exactly what she said, but his tone in later interviews hinted at the power of the exchange. He spoke of making peace and being thankful for the chance to say goodbye. For a man who had built his career on the power of the right words, the fact that he kept hers private said everything about their significance. They were his to hold, not the public's to dissect. Still, those who had been close to Tammy were clear on one thing. Her final words had been warm, affectionate, and without bitterness. They were an acknowledgement of what they had shared and an unspoken agreement that, despite everything, neither would rewrite the other out of their story. It was the kind of closure that many people never get, and one that George seemed to treasure in the years that followed. For fans, hearing that Tammy's final words were filled with grace and love was a comfort. The Wynette-Jones relationship had always been complicated, woven with both devotion and difficulty. To know that it ended with kindness gave their story a sense of completion, even if it wasn't the fairy tale ending they once seemed destined for. George often paid tribute to Tammy in the years after her passing. When he performed their classics Golden Ring, We're Gonna Hold On, Two-Story House. The emotion in his voice was unmistakable. It was as though the weight of that last conversation followed him on stage, lending new depth to every lyric. In private, friends say, there were moments when the memory would surface unexpectedly. He might pause mid-story, his eyes growing distant, or fall silent for a beat longer than usual. Those pauses spoke volumes. They were reminders that her last words had not been simply a goodbye, but a lasting presence he carried with him. For George Jones, Tammy Wynette was never just an ex-wife or a duet partner. She was a chapter of his life that could never be closed completely. And in her final moments, she had given him something rare, the assurance that, for all their trials, the love they had once shared was real, and in some way, it was still there. In the years after Tammy Wynette's passing in April of 1998, George Jones stepped onto countless stages, recorded new albums, and accepted Lifetime Achievement honors. Yet no matter where he was or who he was performing for, there was always a sense that part of him was singing to someone who was no longer in the room. Those close to him say Tammy's final words were never far from his mind. They had softened him in ways that were subtle but unmistakable. George had always been a man of extremes, capable of great warmth, but also quick to retreat into himself when wounded. After Tammy's passing, the edges seemed to wear down. He spoke less about the fights and the struggles, and more about the music they made together and the good years they'd shared. When he performed He Stopped Loving Her Today, a song already considered one of the most emotional in country music history, audiences noticed something different. The pauses were longer. The words seemed heavier. Many fans believed that, in his mind, he wasn't just singing about the character in the song, he was thinking about Tammy and about the journey they had taken from the back roads of touring buses to the very top of the charts. George continued to give interviews over the next 15 years, and while he never revealed Tammy's exact last words, his descriptions of that final meeting made it clear how much they meant to him. "We made peace" was as far as he would go publicly, but those 3 words alone told fans that something meaningful had passed between them. In an industry where relationships can be as short-lived as hit singles, theirs had endured in one form or another for nearly 3 decades. His wife Nancy, who had helped him turn his life around after years of personal turmoil, was often credited by George for saving him. Yet even Nancy understood the unique place Tammy held in his heart. She was part of his story, not in competition with his present life, but as an inseparable piece of his past. Friends say Nancy supported George in speaking about Tammy with love and respect, knowing it didn't diminish what they shared as husband and wife. The turning point came in 2013, when George himself fell ill. As he faced his own mortality, those who visited him in the hospital said his conversations often drifted to the people who had shaped his life. Tammy was always on that list. One friend recalled George saying that he was grateful they'd had that last meeting, that it allowed him to leave nothing unsaid, at least in his own heart. When George Jones passed away on April 26, 2013, tributes poured in from across the music world. Many of them included photographs of him with Tammy Wynette, smiling under stage lights or sharing a microphone. The images reminded fans that, for all the complications, they had once been the dream pairing of country music, and in some way, they still were. At his funeral, one of their duets played softly over the speakers as the crowd reflected on his life. It was a poignant reminder that George and Tammy's story had never really ended. It had simply shifted from the public stage to the private space of memory. And for those who knew the truth of their final conversation, it was impossible to hear their voices together without remembering that, in the end, love had the last word. Tammy Wynette and George Jones lived a story that could have been written as a country song filled with love, heartbreak, distance, and, in the end, a moment of quiet reconciliation. Their music told the world one version of their lives, but it was that final private exchange that gave the truest ending. Tammy's last words, remembered by those close to them as words of love and forgiveness, were not just for George. They were for the life they had built, the music they had created, and the chapter of history they would always share. For George, those words were a reminder that even the most complicated relationships can hold moments of pure grace. They were a gift one he kept close for the rest of his days, and one that fans will always imagine when they hear the two of them sing together. Their story remains one of country music's most enduring legends, not because it was perfect, but because it was real. And in the end, real love, even when it changes shape, can leave a mark that time cannot erase. For more emotional stories, check out this video.